Long before she became the stern voice of Hogwarts, Minerva McGonagall fought a quieter war, the kind that leaves no monuments behind. This is one night of it, a handful of frightened people, a promise to see them safe to morning, and the longest dark she ever held the line through. The silver fox found her halfway down the marble staircase, its paws making no sound on the stone. 3 steps below her, it stopped, lifted its narrow head, and spoke in Elphias Doge's strained voice. 7 marked for collection before morning. Dunbar's Crossing. No escort available. They have been told to expect you. The Patronus dissolved before its last sparks reached the floor. Minerva did not pause to watch them fade. She turned, climbed back to the landing, and let herself into the small staff room where her traveling cloak hung behind the door. From a pocket she drew a folded square of dark green tartan and fastened it firmly over her hair. Firelight caught her spectacles as she checked 3 things in turn: her wand, a small bottle of Dittany, and the thin silver watch she carried on a chain. The castle clock struck 9 while she was already crossing the grounds. Dunbar's Crossing lay beyond the southern edge of the Highlands, a scattering of wizarding houses built around a Muggle road that had not charged a toll in 70 years. She apparated behind a ruined milestone and stood quite still until the dizziness passed. No lamps showed in the cottages. Curtains had been drawn, doors barred, even the owls brought inside. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked once and was abruptly silenced. The meeting place was an abandoned toll house, its slate roof sagging, its single chimney leaning towards the road. She knocked 3 times, waited, then knocked twice more. Bolts scraped within. A man with a pale, narrow face opened the door just far enough to show one frightened eye and the point of a wand. "Professor McGonagall?" he whispered. "Yes." "Mr. Vale, I presume. Lower your wand before you damage the hinges." The door swung back, and warmth, damp wool, and the sharp smell of fear met her all at once. 6 people were gathered in the toll house kitchen. A 7th stood at the window, holding the curtain aside by the width of a finger. Minerva counted them before anyone could speak. A mother and father with 2 children, an elderly man clutching a leather case, a young woman in ministry robes, and Mr. Vale, whose wand still shook faintly in his hand. The mother rose from a bench. Dark hair had been pinned badly at the nape of her neck, and one arm stayed wrapped around a boy of perhaps 8. A smaller girl slept against her shoulder, breathing too quickly for true sleep. "I'm Katrina Muir," she said. "This is my husband Thomas. The children are Iona and Ewan." Minerva inclined her head once. "You were wise to bring only what you could carry." "We left everything else." Thomas's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at the floorboards, as though ashamed of it. "At present you still have what matters?" Beside the cold hearth, the old man gave his name as Orin Sallow, wandmaker and repairer, retired except when he chose not to be. The ministry clerk was Beatrice Fawley, 23, ink-stained, trying hard to hold her chin steady. Mr. Vale's first name turned out to be Gideon. He had owned the toll house 3 weeks under a false name and had never once meant to sleep in it. Minerva listened without interrupting any of them, then crossed to the table and spread out a map beneath the single-shaded lamp. "They know about the northern road," Gideon said. "Doge's message said so. They may know about every road. That is why we shall not use one yet." Beatrice leaned closer. Yet, until dawn, movement makes us easier to see. We remain here while the search is widest, then leave when those searching are tired and those helping us can move openly. One finger came down on the map. There is a protected estate 6 miles east. We reach it after first light. No one answered. The lamp flame trembled in a draft, and Ewan pressed his face into his mother's sleeve. Minerva folded the map along its old creases and looked around the kitchen. Fear had made them small in different ways. Gideon restless, Thomas rigid, Beatrice over-attentive, Orin sunk deep inside his coat. Only Iona slept, one fist closed around a wooden horse with a broken leg. "We shall give the night some order," Minerva said. "Mr. Vale, you know the building. Show me every entrance, including those you believe no one could use. Miss Folly, write down the names of all 7 people here and seal the parchment in this envelope. Mr. Sallow, examine every wand and tell me which can be trusted. Mr. and Mrs. Muir, feed the children now. No one leaves a room without telling me." Gideon swallowed. "And if they come?" She removed her cloak and laid it across the back of a chair. Beneath it she wore deep green robes, fastened high at the throat, severe enough for a classroom and practical enough for a siege. "Then they will find a toll house," she said, and nothing more. And you see, the first ward had already begun to fail. She found it above the front lintel, a concealment charm laid too thinly over rotting timber, fluttering beneath her wand light like torn gauze. She mended it, strengthened the silencing charms on the windows, and turned the rear door into a section of blank stone. In the pantry, a trapdoor waited beneath a sack of moldering flour, and she told Gideon to shift the sack aside. "That only leads to a coal space," he said. "Then it shall lead somewhere more useful before the night is finished." By 10 o'clock, the toll house had changed without appearing to change at all. The kitchen table remained scarred, the hearth cold, the rain stains still marking the ceiling. But a second room now rested between the pantry wall and the outer stones. Narrow, airless, and impossible, according to the measurements of the house. Minerva set 2 benches inside, charmed a vent through the chimney, and tested the false wall 3 times over. Ewan watched from the doorway. "Did you make the room?" "I persuaded the house that it had forgotten one. Will it remember?" "Not tonight." The boy nodded, solemn, accepting this as quite sufficient. Outside, the road lay empty beneath the dark. Minerva stood at the upstairs window and watched the line of trees beyond the fields. Nothing moved between them, and yet the silence had acquired a weight. On the sill lay a dead blue bottle, untouched by dust, and the sight of it made her narrow her eyes. She lowered her wand towards the glass. A faint green thread clung to the corner of the frame. Someone had marked the house. Without haste, she drew the curtain. Below, cups touched saucers, floorboards creaked, and Orin Sallow murmured to Thomas about a crack in his wand handle. Ordinary sounds, carefully kept alive. She went down the staircase, took off her spectacles, and polished them once against the edge of her tartan sleeve. "Everyone into the hidden room," she said. "Quietly, we begin again." The hidden room took all 7 of them badly. Thomas went in first and struck his shoulder against the narrow frame. Beatrice caught her sleeve on a nail that had not existed 10 minutes earlier. Gideon nearly dropped his wand. trying to help everyone at once. Katrina carried Iona in both arms, and Ewan walked beside her, silent now, the wooden horse held against his chest. Orin Sallow came last, clutching the leather case beneath his coat. Only when the false wall had closed over them did Minerva turn back to the kitchen. She moved through the toll house, putting out every sign of haste. A cup left half full was emptied and dried. The blankets on the benches she folded, though not neatly enough to suggest preparation. 7 damp footprints near the back door became 2 old patches of mud. A child's small mitten she transfigured into a twist of gray rag beneath the stove. Only then did she return to the upstairs window. The green thread still clung to the pane, not a tracking charm in the usual sense, nor any ministry marker she knew. When she touched it with the tip of her wand, it tightened like a drawn wire and gave off a smell of scorched rosemary. Whoever had placed it would know the instant it broke. Minerva left it where it was. From beyond the southern copse came the first faint crack of apparition. No one in the hidden room made a sound. Even the house appeared to notice. The chimney stopped its low moaning, and the old clock on the mantel hesitated between beats. Minerva came down, set the lamp low, and settled beside the cold hearth. With a book open across her knees, she did not read a word of it. A second crack, nearer, then a third. Several minutes passed before boots reached the road, unhurried and numerous enough to be counted one by one. Gravel shifted under them. One person stopped at the gate while another worked along the side of the house. Testing the windows with a wand, Minerva turned one page. The first knock was polite, twice a pause, then once more. Gideon had warned her earlier that no neighbor used that pattern, though the false wall stayed indistinguishable from the pantry plaster. She could feel 7 people behind it, holding themselves rigid in the dark. Iona gave a small sleeping murmur, smothered at once against her mother's shoulder. The knock came again, harder. Minerva closed the book and rose. Before opening the door, she altered the set of her shoulders and let weariness into her face. Her spectacles stayed exactly where they always sat. She drew back one bolt, then the other, and opened the door no wider than courtesy required. 2 figures stood beneath the leaning porch, traveling cloaks, worn with the hoods down, and their faces bare, as though they had nothing to conceal. The taller was a broad man, fair hair cropped close to the skull. Beside him, a narrow woman kept her gloves buttoned at the wrist, despite the mildness of the night. 3 more shadows waited by the road. "Late for visitors," Minerva said. The fair-haired man looked past her shoulder. "We are searching for fugitives." "Then you have taken a poor road. There is nowhere to run from here except into peat." His mouth shifted without becoming a smile, and he asked her name. "Marion Bell. I own this house." The woman's gaze settled on the tartan at Minerva's hair, moved to the spectacles, then to the severe green robes. Recognition came close enough to touch, without quite arriving. "You look familiar," she said. "I taught Transfiguration for 12 years. Most people who failed it remember me." The fair-haired man raised his wand and told her to step aside. Minerva did not move, and asked on whose authority. The wand came level with her sternum. Behind him, one of the shadows by the road turned its head towards the upstairs window. and the green thread tightened against the glass, invisible from below but sharp in her awareness. She kept one hand resting lightly against the doorframe. "Authority is changing," the man said. "So I have noticed." Over Minerva's shoulder, the woman examined the front room, her eyes crossing the lamp, the cold hearth, the solitary cup, the book left open upon the chair. "You live here alone?" "I am beginning to understand why." The remark passed without laughter. Then the fair-haired man placed one boot over the threshold, and Minerva allowed him half a step before she touched her wand to the timber beside her. The tollhouse groaned. Dust fell from the lintel, the floor dipped under his weight, and the ceiling above the porch gave a long, dangerous crack. He withdrew at once. A slab of plaster struck the stone where his shoulder had been. Minerva looked up with controlled irritation, as though the house had embarrassed her in front of strangers. "The west side is unsound," she said. "You may enter, but I advise against gathering beneath it." For the first time, uncertainty passed between the two of them. Small, but she saw it. The woman glanced towards the road, where their companions had begun checking the ditch and the ruined milestone. Studying the ceiling, the fair-haired man pointed his wand into the house and sent a pale sphere of light through the doorway. It drifted over the chairs, beneath the table, on towards the pantry. She felt the hidden room's outer skin tighten as the spell approached. Ewan's wooden horse tapped once against stone. The light stopped. Minerva lowered her eyes to the man's sleeve. "There's chalk on your cuff," she said. "From my gatepost, I imagine." His attention shifted for less than a second. "Enough." Her wand moved inside the fold of her robes, and the pale sphere slid sideways, brushing the pantry wall without touching it. The false surface stayed dull and empty. Nothing in the house breathed. At last the woman stepped back from the porch. "The mark is still intact," she said quietly. "No one has left." Displeased by the absence of proof, the fair-haired man looked past Minerva once more. "We will be nearby." "I had gathered that." He turned away and the others followed, their footsteps separating along the road until darkness swallowed them. Minerva stayed in the doorway, watching until the last cloak passed beyond the gate. Only when the night had settled again did she close the door and restore both bolts. Her hand rested on the wood a moment longer than necessary. Behind the false wall, someone began to cry without making a sound. Minerva opened the hidden room only after she had checked every window and listened at both doors. The green thread still held to the upstairs pane unbroken, and no second mark had appeared elsewhere. When the false wall drew back, warm, stale air rushed into the pantry. Beatrice Folly stood pressed into the far corner, one hand clamped over her mouth, tears running between her fingers. Katrina held Iona against her chest and kept her other hand on Ewan's shoulder. Thomas had put himself in front of them all, though there had been nowhere to move and nothing he could have stopped. Gideon's wand pointed at the floor. On the bench, Orrin Sallow sat with his leather case balanced across his knees, eyes fixed on Beatrice. "They knew," Beatrice whispered. "They knew someone had been here."
"They knew the house had been marked," Minerva said. "That is not the same thing." "They will come back." "Yes?" That single word steadied the room more than any comfort could have. Thomas lowered his arms. Gideon looked up. Even Beatrice drew one uneven breath and took her hand from her mouth. ashamed of the noise she had not made. Minerva counted them again. 7 faces, all pale, all present. She checked Iona's hands for cold, and Ewan's pulse with 2 fingers at his wrist, then turned to Orin about the wands. Mr. Vales has a weak core response under strain, the wandmaker said. His voice was dry and careful, each word chosen as though it might later need repairing. Mr. Muirs is sound. Mrs. Muirs is temperamental but loyal. Miss Foley's is ministry issue, and it resents her. Beatrice blinked at him. Wands do not resent people. This one does. Can it cast? If spoken to firmly. Minerva took the ministry wand from her and tested it with a small charm. A thread of silver light appeared, trembled, and tied itself into a knot. She undid the knot and handed the wand back. You will use it only if I instruct you. Until then, keep it drawn, but pointed down. What are we doing now? Gideon asked. We continue. He glanced towards the ceiling. As if nothing happened? As if precisely that happened, and we are still here. The concealed room could not hold them for a whole night. Its air had already gone close, and the chimney vent carried sound both ways. So Minerva divided the toll house into stations. Katrina and the children went to the rear parlor, where the windows had been transfigured into painted wall panels from the inside. Thomas took the foot of the stairs, Gideon the pantry, Beatrice the kitchen table with the map and the watch list. Orin remained by the hearth. At last he opened his leather case, and inside lay 6 unfinished wand shafts wrapped in faded cloth, a handful of silver tools, and several narrow boxes labeled in a cramped hand. None of the shafts held cores. Even so, the sight of them changed his posture, and his fingers stopped trembling as he arranged the tools by size. You brought your work, Minerva said. I brought what I could not leave to them. Can any of it strengthen the wards? No. He looked towards the door. But I can tell when a spell is pressing against timber. Wood complains before stone does. Minerva placed him where he could touch, both the hearth beam and the floorboards. To Ewan she gave the task of carrying messages between rooms, provided he walked and never spoke above a whisper, and the boy accepted this with grave attention. His wooden horse went into his pocket, its broken leg protruding like a small pale handle. At 11:15, the first probing charm brushed the eastern wall. Orin's hand tightened around the beam. There, he murmured. High and slow. Minerva crossed the kitchen and laid 2 fingers against the plaster. A cold pressure traveled over the outer stones, searching for seams in the concealment spells. It passed above the hidden room, paused at the sealed rear door, and doubled back towards the chimney. Whoever cast it stayed out of sight. She redirected the charm into the abandoned coal space beneath the pantry. Below, dust stirred, and something scratched inside the walls. Gideon flinched. Rats? An excellent suggestion. 1 turn of her wand, and 3 lumps of coal became lean gray rats. They scattered through the cellar, knocked over a shovel, sent a tin bucket clanging across the floor. Outside, the probing charm vanished at once. The toll house waited. Minutes went by before footsteps approached the rear of the building. 1 person this time picking a careful path through nettles and broken stone. 2 fingers from Minerva.
Thomas gathered the children closer. Beatrice lowered the lamp, and Gideon pressed himself beside the pantry door. On the sealed rear entrance, the latch shifted, though no door remained there. A thin blade of blue light traced the outline where the frame had been. Found stone moved left, then right, and faded. From the parlor came a small intake of breath. Iona was awake. She had glimpsed the blue line through a crack beneath the inner door and begun to struggle in her mother's arms. Katrina bent over her, whispering into her hair, but the child's shoes struck the leg of a chair. Once, twice. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Without haste, Minerva went into the parlor and crouched before the girl. Iona's face was blotched with sleep and fear, her mouth open around a cry that had not yet escaped. Minerva pulled the tartan from her own hair and folded it around the child's shoulders, where the wool nearly covered her from chin to knees. "I require your help," she whispered. Iona only stared at her. "There is a man outside who must believe this room is empty. Can you sit so still that he makes a fool of himself?" The child's mouth closed. Her fingers caught the edge of the tartan and gripped it. Katrina pressed her lips to Iona's temple, then met Minerva's eyes over the child's head. A shadow crossed the false window. On the outside wall, where no door existed, the handle of the parlor door began to turn. Ancient hinges gave a faint, remembered squeal beneath the spell, and Minerva placed herself between the sound and the family, her wand lowered along her skirt. For several seconds, the unseen hand tested the impossible entrance. Then it withdrew. Away through the nettles, the footsteps went, slow at first, then faster. No crack of apparition followed. Their watcher had not gone far. Minerva stayed crouched until Iona's grip loosened. The tartan had slipped over one of the child's ears, leaving the other uncovered and pink. She adjusted it, rose, and returned to the kitchen. Beatrice had marked the time on the watch list in a hand that was jagged but legible. 10:57, rear wall tested. No entry. Below it, after a pause, she added another line. All 7 remain. For 23 minutes, the watcher held his place beyond the rear wall. Orin felt each shift of weight through the timber and marked it by tapping one fingernail against his case, a sound barely louder than dust settling. Minerva stood at the kitchen table with the map open before her, though her attention never left the old man's hand. At last he lifted 2 fingers, then slowly closed them. "Gone?" Gideon whispered. "Moved farther off. There is still pressure in the ground." Minerva checked the silver watch. 11:20. Dawn would not begin to gray the east for more than 6 hours, and the road to the protected estate was still watched. She folded the map again, along a different line this time, and set a salt cellar at the tollhouse, a spoon at the eastern copse, and 3 black buttons along the northern road. Around her, the household gathered in a silence that had become disciplined. "We must assume they have divided into pairs," she said. "One at the road, one behind the house, others searching the neighboring properties. They expect us to move because they have made staying unpleasant." Thomas looked towards the parlor. "They're succeeding?" "They have made staying unpleasant," Minerva repeated. "They have not made it impossible." Beatrice had stopped crying, but the skin beneath her eyes was still raw. She dipped her quill and drew a narrow line from the house to the eastern estate. "What if they already know where we're going?" Then we shall not reward them by arriving early." The clerk pressed too hard. Her nib split, sending a drop of ink across the map, and she stared at the stain as though it were evidence of some deeper failure. Minerva took the quill from her, mended the nib with a touch of her wand, and set it back beside her hand. "Write the next watch, midnight to 12:30. Mr. Vale at the upper window, Mr. Muir at the stair, Mrs. Muir with the children. You will remain here with me." "Why?" "Because your hand shakes less when it has work." A faint flush rose along the young woman's throat. She bent over the page and began to write. Around them, the toll house settled in layers. Pipes clicked in the walls. The chimney breathed. And somewhere beneath the pantry, the transfigured rats worried at a sack of old grain. Each sound had to be learned and separated from the sounds outside. Twice Gideon came down from the upper floor to report movement that proved to be branches, then once more with nothing to report at all. At 11:35, Ewan appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying 2 cups, one of weak tea, the other water with a leaf floating in it. "Mum says you have not had anything," he whispered. Minerva accepted the tea. "Your mother is observant. She says you'll forget. Your mother is impertinent." The boy's eyes widened, uncertain whether he had carried an insult across the room. She drank half the tea and returned the cup to him. Tell her she was also correct. Ewan's mouth moved towards a smile, then stopped when something struck the front gate. The sound was light and metallic. Everyone froze. A second object landed on the road, rolled through the gravel, and came to rest against the threshold with a faint chime. Minerva held up one hand to keep them where they were and went to the door alone. Through the narrow gap beneath it, green light leaked across the floorboards. She crouched without touching the wood. The object outside gave another delicate chime, almost pleasant, and then a child's voice called from the road. "Mum?" Katrina's cup slipped against its saucer. The voice came again, thin with cold. "Mum, open the door." In the parlor, Iona woke and answered before anyone could stop her. "I'm here." Katrina covered the girl's mouth, but the words had already traveled through the house. Thomas took one step towards the front door, and Minerva turned on him so sharply that he stopped with both hands clenched at his sides. "That is not your child," she said. "It sounds like her, which is why it was used." Outside, the false voice began to cry. It was a careful imitation, breath catching in the same places, small sobs breaking between words. Ewan stood rigid beside the table, both cups trembling in his hands, and Minerva crossed to him and took them before they spilled. "Look at your sister," she said. He did. "She is in the parlor. Then whatever is outside cannot be her." Still the crying continued. Tomas turned his face from the door, jaw working as if he were biting through something hard. Katrina carried Iona into the kitchen so that both children could be seen at once. The girl still wrapped in Minerva's tartan, sleepy and confused, while the voice beyond the threshold begged to be let in. Orin bent close to the floorboards. A memory bell. Old work. It catches voices from a house and plays them back with need added. "Can it hear us now?" Beatrice asked. "Only if the door opens." Minerva drew her wand and pointed it at the ceiling rather than the threshold. A thin crack opened in the plaster above the porch. Dust sifted down outside, and a slate loosened from the roof with a soft scrape. She waited until the false child called again. Then the slate fell. Metal shattered against stone. Green light flared under the door and vanished, and the crying stopped in the middle of a breath. No one moved until the last fragments had finished ringing across the road. Minerva lowered her wand. Add it to the watch list. Beatrice stared at the door a moment longer, then dipped her quill. 11:42, she said quietly. Listening device destroyed. Memory bell, Orin corrected. She wrote the proper name. Beneath it, after a glance around the room, she added the line that had become their measure of the night. All 7 remain. Midnight arrived without a bell. On the mantel, the clock had stopped at 11:58, its hands caught between one moment and the next, and Minerva noticed only because Beatrice looked up from the watch list and frowned at it. A small movement of her wand released the mechanism. The clock gave 2 apologetic clicks and began again. No one marked the hour aloud. In the parlor, Katrina settled Iona beneath 2 coats, while Thomas sat on the floor beside Ewan with his back against the wall. Gideon took his place upstairs, and Orin stayed by the hearth, with one palm resting on the beam. Beatrice drew a fresh line across the page and wrote midnight in careful letters. The first half hour passed without any movement beyond the house, and that silence unsettled Gideon more than the searches had. Twice he came down to ask whether Minerva could still feel the mark at the upstairs window, and twice he returned before she'd finished answering. On the 3rd trip, she stopped him at the foot of the stairs. You will remain at your post for 15 minutes, she said. If you see something, report it. If you see nothing, continue seeing nothing. His face tightened. I am trying. I know. The simple reply held him. Gideon drew one breath, nodded, and went back up with his wand held closer to his body. Minerva watched until his shoes disappeared above the landing, then turned towards the parlor. Ewan had not slept. Cross-legged beside his sister, he rubbed the broken leg of the wooden horse with his thumb. Thomas murmured something too low to catch, but the boy only shook his head and looked towards the kitchen. Minerva crossed the room and crouched beside him. Is there a difficulty? I can hear them walking. Thomas looked startled. I can't. Minerva listened. At first there was only the faint scratch of the rats beneath the pantry and the slow tick of the clock. Then below both came a soft pressure in the earth, regular and distant, footsteps moving around the tollhouse in a widening circle. You have sharp ears, she said. Ewan leaned closer. Are they coming in? No, they're measuring how frightened we are. How can they measure that? By waiting to see what we do. The boy considered this, then slipped the wooden horse into Minerva's hand. Can you fix him? One foreleg had broken cleanly at the knee. She touched the splintered wood with her wand and restored the joint, leaving a narrow pale seam where the damage had been. Ewan tested it once and set the horse down beside Iona's sleeping hand. At 12:20, Orin's fingers stiffened against the beam. Pressure from the road, he murmured, heavy more than one wand. Minerva crossed to the front room. No light showed beneath the door this time, and no boots disturbed the gravel, yet the green thread at The upstairs window tightened sharply, pulling against its own anchor as a low vibration entered the walls. The ward over the lintel began to peel away. It did not fail in a flash. One edge lifted, then another, each strand loosening under steady force from outside. Minerva set her wand against the door frame and reinforced the charm without breaking the hidden mark. Sweat gathered beneath the arms of her robes as the pressure increased. Beatrice stood behind her, the watch list clutched to her chest. Can they force it open? They can force anything open eventually. The young woman's breath shortened. Eventually is not tonight, Minerva added. Across the room, Orin opened one of the narrow boxes from his case and drew out a strip of blackthorn no longer than his finger, then pressed it into a crack in the hearth beam. The wood gave a faint hum, low and resonant, and the strain in the front wall shifted towards it. "What have you done?" Minerva asked. "Given the house somewhere else to complain." The lintel ward settled. Outside, the pressure changed direction, searching for another weakness, and the blackthorn strip began to smoke. Orin watched it darken without touching it. 3 minutes, he said. Then 3 minutes will suffice. Minerva moved through the tollhouse, strengthening each join as the probing force traveled from wall to wall. At the pantry, the false stone buckled inward by half an inch. At the upper landing, a pane cracked from corner to corner without breaking. In the parlor, Katrina held both children beneath the coats while Thomas braced the painted window with his shoulder, though he knew physical strength could do little against the spell. The pressure reached the rear wall and stopped. For a moment, the whole house leaned towards the road. Then the blackthorn strip split with a dry snap, and the force vanished so suddenly that Minerva staggered a step and caught herself against the banister. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a man cursed. A crack of apparition sounded near the gate, followed by 2 more farther down the road. The searchers had withdrawn, though Minerva did not mistake withdrawal for departure. She returned to the kitchen, where Orin was carefully lifting the scorched blackthorn from the beam with silver pincers. "That was the only piece I had," he said. Minerva looked at the ruined strip. Then it was well spent. Beatrice sat down at the table and found her place on the watch list. Her hand shook once, then steadied as she wrote, 12:27, sustained pressure against outer wards, no breach. She looked around the toll house before adding the final line, all 7 remain. The silence, after the pressure spell, felt worse than the spell itself. Walls that had groaned and shifted now stood perfectly still, as though listening for what the people inside would do next. Minerva stayed by the banister until her breathing had returned to its usual measure, then straightened her spectacles, checked the landing above, and resumed the watch as if the house had merely settled. At 12:40, Beatrice carried the written list to the hearth and held it near the low lamp. Where her damp fingers had touched the parchment, the ink had begun to feather. "Should we destroy this?" she asked. "If they enter, they will have every name. If they enter, the list will be the least of our concerns. I thought records mattered. They do. That is why you will keep it accurate." The clerk went back to the table, uncertain whether she had been reassured or rebuked. Orin closed his case and rested both hands upon it. At the foot of the stairs sat Thomas, his wand across his knees, while Katrina dozed upright for less than a minute at a time. Each time her head lowered, she woke with a start and counted the children by touch. From above, Gideon called softly, "Professor." Minerva climbed without asking what he had seen. He stood beside the cracked window, one finger pressed against the curtain. Beyond the glass, 3 dim lights moved through the fields, too low and steady to be lanterns, advancing in a line towards the toll house, each separated by 20 yards of darkness. "Wands," Gideon whispered. "Decoys." The nearest light stopped beside the stone wall and rose to the height of a person's chest. A shape formed around it, shoulders, a hood, an arm extended towards the house. The second light copied it, and then the third. Gideon's breath quickened. There are 3 of them. There are 3 lights. One of the figures raised its glowing arm. A red spell struck the eastern wall, hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Another followed from the opposite field, then a third from behind the gate. Each attack came from a different direction, separated by several seconds, as though unseen duelists were closing in. Downstairs, Iona began to cry. Minerva left Gideon at the window and descended. Thomas had risen with his wand drawn, turning from one wall to another. Beatrice stood beside the table, her chair overturned behind her, while Katrina tried to gather both children into her arms. Every impact flattened the lamp flame. "They are surrounding us," Thomas said. "They want you to believe that." A 4th spell struck the roof. Slate rattled down the western slope, and a fragment crashed through the porch canopy. The sound broke what remained of Gideon's control. He came down the stairs too quickly, missed the final step, and caught himself against the wall. "The rear field is full of them," he said. "I saw one near the ditch." "You saw an outline made of light? It cast at us? So does a child's toy broom, if poorly designed." Nothing in her voice softened it. Minerva crossed to the kitchen door, took Thomas's wand hand between both of hers, and lowered it until the point faced the floor. His grip held for a second, then let go. "Listen to the spacing," she said. A spell hit the front wall. 7 seconds passed before a second struck the chimney. 8 this time. The next glanced off the sealed rear entrance after nearly the same delay, and Beatrice said what everyone had begun to hear. "Ah, they're repeating." "Yes." Minerva drew her wand and sent a thin white thread up through the ceiling. It passed into the night without so much as brushing the wards, split above the roof, and came down towards the 3 false figures. Where it touched them, the shapes wavered. Beneath each stood a small brass disc, turning slowly in the grass. "Projection markers," Oren said. "They need line of sight from somewhere." She traced the white thread back through the darkness until it drew tight towards the northern copse. Concealed there between 2 ash trees, a single wand directed all 3 devices. One person had made the toll house feel besieged. She did not attack the hidden watcher. Instead, she turned each brass disc half a degree with a precise flick, and the next red spell missed the house, crossed the field, and struck a projection of its own. Light collided with light. All 3 false figures folded inward, flared green, and were gone. Darkness came back at once. For a while, no one spoke. The toll house stood intact, though plaster dust powdered the floor, and one slate went on sliding slowly down the roof. Ewan came out from beneath his mother's arm and looked up at the ceiling. There was only one. One person and 3 pieces of brass. Will they come back? Almost certainly. He nodded as though this too could be filed away in the order of the night. At 1:15, Beatrice righted her chair and went back to writing. The projection markers, the direction of control, the damage to the roof. Then she paused over the final line, counting carefully before the quill touched the parchment. All 7 remain. By 1:30, the tollhouse had begun to smell of hot dust and overworked magic. The repaired lintel ward flickered whenever the chimney drew, and faint cracks had crept along the edges of the painted panels over the parlor windows. Minerva moved room to room with her wand in one hand, and in the other, a mug of tea gone cold and untouched. Each repair held. None held quite as cleanly as before. By the hearth, Orin sat with his silver tools laid across his knees, listening to the timber shifting his palm from beam to floorboard as the pressure outside changed. They are testing the same places twice now, he said, learning which parts tire first. So are we. Beatrice entered the time on her list. Her handwriting stayed steady, though she had started pressing her tongue against the inside of her cheek as she wrote. Thomas watched the front door. Katrina had managed to settle Iona once more, though the child still wore Minerva's tartan and would not let go of its edge. Upstairs, Gideon stood at the cracked window and stared out towards the fields. No lights out there now, no false figures, nothing he could put a name to. And that absence had become unbearable to him. Every few minutes he wiped his palms on his trousers and leaned closer to the narrow gap in the curtain. At 1:42, a single owl crossed the road. He flinched, raised his wand, and the movement caught the curtain and dragged it back 3 inches. Cold air came through the cracked pane, and the green thread fixed to its corner gleamed once in the dark. Minerva reached the landing before he had lowered his arm. She drew the curtain shut and looked at him over the rims of her spectacles. You were told not to disturb this window. I thought I saw someone.
You saw an owl. It could have been transfigured. It could also have been an owl. His face reddened. You cannot know that. No, which is why I watched before acting. He turned away, breathing through his nose. Below them the clock ticked, and Ewan murmured in his sleep. Ordinary sounds, and they seemed to irritate him now, each one proof that the night was passing too slowly. Minerva stepped nearer and told him he would go downstairs and sit beside Mr. Sallow. I am on watch. You are no longer useful on watch. The words landed hard. Gideon looked towards the staircase, then back at the curtain. I brought them here. I gave them this place. And you have helped keep them in it until they burn it down. Her expression did not move. Go downstairs. For a moment it seemed he would refuse. Then his shoulders dropped, and he passed her without a word, and she stayed beside the window until his footsteps reached the kitchen. The green thread had brightened. A tiny pulse ran through it, traveling outward rather than in. The brief exposure of the curtain had been enough for the mark to taste the room behind the glass. Minerva touched her wand to the frame and felt the spell carrying a message away through the dark. They know the house is occupied, she said. No one downstairs asked how certain she was.
Thomas rose, Katrina gathered the children, and Beatrice set the cork into the ink bottle with both hands while Orrin began packing his tools into the leather case. "We move?" Gideon asked. "Not yet." His laugh came out as a dry breath. "What more are we waiting for?"
"A route that is not watched." "We have no route." "We have one when I say we have one." He stared at her. Fear had hollowed the skin beneath his eyes, and sweat shone at his temples despite the cold. "You promised we would reach morning." "I said we would hold until dawn." "There is no difference if they are already coming." From the northern field came the crack of apparition. Another answered near the road, a third behind the house, and after them the low hiss of several spells striking the outer wards at once. The tollhouse shuddered. Cups fell from a shelf and shattered across the floor. The painted window panels bowed inward, and the sealed rear entrance flashed white around its edges. Minerva raised both arms and caught the pressure before it reached the hidden room. "Stations," she ordered. Everyone moved except Gideon. Thomas took the stairs. Katrina brought the children into the pantry. Beatrice seized the watch list and the lamp, while Orrin braced both hands against the hearth beam. Gideon stayed near the kitchen door, staring at the green light forcing itself beneath the threshold. Another spell struck, and the lintel charm tore down the middle. Minerva repaired it at once, but the effort traveled through her wrist like a blow. The front wall groaned. Somewhere above, glass broke. "We cannot stay," Gideon said. "We are staying for the next 5 minutes. And after that?" "I shall tell you after that." His wand hand tightened. "You don't know." The accusation cut through the room more sharply than the spells outside. Beatrice looked up from the lamp. Thomas paused halfway up the stairs. Even Orrin's fingers went still against the beam. Minerva held the failing ward in place. "No," she said, "I do not yet." That left nowhere for Gideon's fear to hide. His mouth opened, but no words came. A heavy impact struck the eastern wall, and the pantry shelves tipped forward. Iona screamed. Gideon moved. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, tore open the trapdoor beneath the flour sack, and dropped into the coal space before Minerva could release the ward. Beatrice lunged for his sleeve and caught nothing. Thomas shouted his name, but Gideon was already forcing open the narrow cellar hatch that led beneath the rear foundation. "Stop him," Minerva said. Thomas went down after him into the coal space. A gust of cold air rushed up, carrying wet earth and the smell of nettles, and then came the sound Minerva had feared most, a fine brittle snapping beneath the floor. The rear boundary ward broke. Green light flooded through the cracks between the boards, and every concealment charm in the tollhouse trembled at once, their edges suddenly visible like frost upon glass. Outside, someone called out, and several sets of boots began running towards the house. Thomas hauled Gideon back through the trapdoor by the collar. The young man fought him wildly, kicking coal across the floor. "Let me go," he gasped. "There's still time." "There was," Minerva said. She released the front ward. The house drew in its breath as the spell fell apart, and Minerva caught the loosed force before it could scatter, driving it down through the floorboards. Stones split beneath the pantry. With a grinding roar, the coal space stretched, its walls drawing apart, and the broken rear ward folded down into the earth and sealed itself behind a fresh passage. The outer door burst inward. A flick of Minerva's wand turned the kitchen table into a thick wall of black stone, and a curse struck it at once, cracking the surface from top to bottom. She did not answer it. She swept lamp, map, Dittany, and Orin's case towards the open trap door in one precise movement. "Down," she said, "all of you." Katrina lowered Iona first. Ewan went after, the repaired horse clamped between his teeth to leave both hands free, and Beatrice climbed down behind them with the watch list tucked inside her robes. Thomas forced Gideon ahead of him. Orin came last of that group, careful, one hand on the ladder and the other cradling his case. The stone wall split a second time. A masked figure showed in the gap, wand raised, but before the curse could leave it, Minerva transfigured the broken table legs into a lattice of iron bars and drove them the length of the kitchen. She stepped onto the ladder last. Overhead, the toll house filled with green light and falling plaster. Below waited 7 frightened faces in the passage she had made out of darkness and necessity. She pulled the trapdoor shut, sealed it with what was left of the lintel ward, and climbed down. As the first section of ceiling came apart across the kitchen floor, the passage was barely high enough for Thomas to stand in. Freshly split stone pressed close on both sides, damp with soil, threaded through with roots that shivered whenever the toll house shook above. Minerva came off the last rung and sealed the trapdoor with a second charm laid beneath the first. A curse landed overhead, muffled now by earth, and shook a scatter of grit down into her hair. "Move east, single file. Mr. Muir first, Mrs. Muir and the children behind him, Miss Fawley next, Mr. Sallow, then Mr. Vale. I shall follow." Coal dust streaked Gideon's face, and there was blood on one knuckle where Thomas had hauled him back. His chest went up and down too fast. He looked from the sealed trapdoor to the black passage ahead and made no move towards the line. "I broke it," he said. "Yes. I thought the hatch led to the ditch." "It did." His eyes held hers, waiting for anger or for pardon. She gave him neither. She took his wand, tested the grip, and handed it back, handle first. "You will walk in front of me. You will put your feet where Mr. Sallow puts his, and you will not touch another door." None of that first stretch of passage had existed before tonight. Minerva had forced it through packed soil on the strength of the collapsing wards, but improvised transfiguration answered shape more willingly than it answered distance, and after 30 yards the stone walls drew in and stopped against a face of hard clay. Thomas halted before it and turned, his shadow thrown large against the wand light. "There is nowhere to go." "There will be." She moved past the others and set her palm to the clay. Somewhere beyond it, cold water pulsed, faint but steady. She thought of the survey map spread on the kitchen table, its faded blue line running under the abandoned road before curving east towards the old mill estate. The watercourse ought to have lain 6 feet lower. The night's subsidence, or else the mapmaker's carelessness, had brought it near enough to reach. Behind them the trapdoor groaned. Orin tilted his head. "They have found the seal?" "How long?" Beatrice asked. "Longer than before, shorter than we require." Minerva drew a rectangle on the clay with the tip of her wand. The earth inside it hardened to brick, then parted into neat blocks that slid without sound into the walls.
Wet air came in through the opening, and beyond it lay a stone conduit half full of dark, fast-moving water. Katrina looked down at Iona's thin shoes. She cannot walk through that. She will not have to. 2 fallen roots became a narrow wooden platform under Minerva's wand, and she set it on the current, where it rocked once and steadied. Low rails rose along the sides.
A rope formed at the front, long enough for Thomas to draw it from the shallower edge. Children and Mr. Sallow on the platform. The rest of us walk. Orin stiffened. I am capable of waiting. You are carrying what may yet be useful, and the water is moving faster than you are. He looked ready to object, thought better of it, and climbed aboard beside Iona. Ewan settled at the front, the wooden horse tucked inside his coat. The platform dipped under their weight and held. The first surge of water reached Beatrice's knees and pulled a sharp breath out of her. Thomas leaned into the rope. Katrina walked alongside the platform, with one hand on Iona's shoulder. Gideon followed Orin's instructions to the letter, stepping stone to stone with his wand held low. Minerva went in last, and the cold shut around her calves like iron. Above and behind them something gave way. The sound came down the passage as a deep crack, and then the collapse of stone, and dust rolled out of the opening they had cut. Green fire lit the clay tunnel for an instant before Minerva sealed the breach with a wall of fused rock. They are through the trapdoor, Thomas said. They are no longer through this wall. East it curved, the conduit under the fields. Its ceiling came down until everyone had to bend, and the water climbed to Minerva's thighs. Moss shone pale in the wand light. Every few yards a side channel opened into the dark, carrying whispers of water from forgotten drains and wells. At the third junction the current divided, and Thomas stopped with the rope wrapped round his forearm. Which way? She looked into both branches. The left ran broad and level. The right narrowed under a ridge of black stone. Only one channel had been marked on the old survey, and nothing now remained to say which of these it was. Behind them came a faint scrape of stone against stone. Their pursuers had begun to open the sealed breach. Minerva raised her wand and sent a silver thread into the left channel. 50 feet on it struck a barrier and came back carrying the smell of rust. A second thread went into the right and vanished past the bend. The right, she said. They had gone 10 yards when the wooden platform struck something under the water and lurched sideways. Iona cried out. Orin caught her before she went over, but his leather case slid off his knees and tipped across the rail. Minerva's left hand closed on the handle. A curse cut down the passage from behind and struck her raised arm. The force spun her against the wall. Pain flashed from shoulder to fingertips, white and absolute, and the case nearly tore loose. Gideon grabbed the platform rope, Thomas dragged it on, and Minerva clamped the leather handle to her ribs and forced herself upright. Her left arm no longer answered. Professor Beatrice said, "Keep moving." Blood was darkening the sleeve of her green robes. She moved Orin's case into her right hand and pushed it back onto the platform, then turned once towards the bend behind them. Wand held across her body. A masked figure came into the channel. She brought the ceiling down between them. Stone met water with a violence the narrow conduit only made worse. The wave lifted the wooden platform.
slammed it against the wall, and drove everyone several steps on. Minerva stayed on her feet by bracing her right shoulder up under the low ceiling. Behind them, the fallen rock ground itself into a barrier, and green light flickered through the gaps. "Move," she said. Thomas hauled the rope once more. Katrina pushed beside him, one arm round the platform rail, the other shielding Iona from the sharp edges of the stone. Ewan crouched by Orin, both hands fisted in the old man's sleeve. Beatrice kept close to Minerva, her eyes on the ruined left arm tucked against her side. "You need Dittany when we stop. You may lose the use of it. I have already lost the use of it." That silenced her. Minerva worked her wand more firmly into her right hand and followed the others round the bend. The pain traveled with every step, no longer bright but deep and pulsing, and blood kept slipping from her cuff into the water. The channel narrowed until the platform could go no farther. Its rails scraped both walls, the current shoved it sideways beneath a low arch, and Thomas pulled once, then again, but the wood jammed hard. Katrina looked at the ceiling. "We cannot carry her through here." "You can carry her," Minerva said. "You cannot carry the platform." With two flicks of her wand, Minerva folded the rails flat, and the boards came apart beneath Orin and the children. What had been a platform was now 3 broad wooden shields, adrift on the surface. Thomas took Iona onto his back. Katrina lifted Ewan. Orin wedged his leather case under one arm and leaned on a shield to hold himself against the current. Beyond the arch, the water deepened. It climbed to Beatrice's waist, then her ribs, cold enough to take the breath out of her. Without being asked, Gideon moved in beside Orin and caught the old man's elbow each time his boots slipped. Nobody mentioned the tollhouse any longer. Their whole world had shrunk to stone, water, and wherever a foot could next go safely. At 2:20, the conduit ran out at an iron grate. Thomas drove his shoulder into it. Rust came away in orange flakes, but the bars held. Past them opened a wider chamber, the stream vanishing under black arches, and out of the dark ahead came a faint draft. Minerva studied the hinges. Charmed against cutting and blasting, the iron was old municipal work laid down to stop anyone tampering with the watercourse by magic. On any other day, she might have admired how thorough it was. Behind them, the first rocks of her barrier shifted. "Can you open it?" Gideon asked. "Yes," she did not add quickly. She set her wand between 2 bars and went to work on the stone that gripped the grate rather than the iron itself. It was delicate business. Each grain had to come loose without bringing down the arch overhead, and the curse in her shoulder sent a tremor through her hand every time she turned her wrist. Beatrice stepped in close enough to take her elbow. "Tell me where." "Do not push. Hold it level." The clerk did as she was told, her own wand still forgotten in her belt, and together they worked the first hinge free and then the second, Thomas holding both children clear of the water, Katrina watching the dark at their backs. Around the bend, a green light appeared. Orin laid a palm flat to the channel wall. 2 people, perhaps 3. "I can delay them," Gideon said, turning with his wand up. "You can stay exactly where you are. I caused this, and running at them will not repair it." Another rock shifted somewhere behind. The green light brightened, and with it came the splash of boots drawing nearer. Gideon's face tightened, but this time he kept his place beside Orin. The lower hinge came free, teeth clenched against the movement in her shoulder, Minerva reshaped the stone around the upper bracket until the grate tipped inward an inch. Thomas set Iona down by Katrina and threw his weight against the bars. Again, they pulled together. The last block tore loose, and the grate dropped into the chamber beyond with a heavy splash. Thomas lifted the children through first, then Orin, then Beatrice and Katrina. A curse struck the water behind Gideon. Steam burst around his legs. He stumbled, and his wand spun out of his hand into the current. Minerva had a fistful of the back of his coat before he went down, hauled him through the gap, and sent the loosened blocks back into the mouth of the passage. It sealed as a second curse hit. For a moment, the new wall glowed red. Then the color drained out of it, and they stood in the larger chamber with nothing but the thin white light of Minerva's wand. Gideon sat down in the water, staring at his empty hand. My wand. Gone. His head went down. Orin opened his leather case and drew out one of the unfinished shafts. A narrow length of rowan tested its balance in his fingers and held it out. No core, it will not cast properly. When Gideon took it anyway, he added, "It may still remind your hand what it is meant to do." The young man closed his fingers around the bare wood and got to his feet. Ahead, past the black arches, the draft brushed their wet clothes with the faintest scent of heather, coming and going with the moving air. Thomas caught it first and lifted his head as though the dark had swung a window open. Minerva put out her wand for 3 breaths to let her eyes adjust, but no natural light showed further on. Still, the air meant something. It meant the chamber joined onto ground that had not been shut under stone for 100 years. They passed beneath the first arch, where the water drained out of the channel into a broad stone basin and left the floor slick and uneven rather than drowned. Katrina carried Iona, whose arms had tightened round her neck. Ewan walked between Thomas and Orin. Gideon kept the rowan in his hand and set down each foot with care. Minerva's left sleeve hung heavy with blood and water. The curse had gone in above the elbow and spread a numb heat through her shoulder, so that the arm felt at once far away and a burden to carry. As they walked, Beatrice uncorked the dittany and held it up without a word, and this time Minerva stopped. 3 drops. Beatrice gave it 5. The wound hissed under the torn cloth. Minerva's knees buckled before she locked them straight again, her right hand shutting hard around her wand. Katrina turned at the sound, but a single shake of the head sent her on, and Minerva moved off before anyone could crowd around her. The second arch split the passage around a pillar carved with a faded mill wheel, one branch sloping down towards the old waterworks, the other climbing through a tunnel braced by oak beams gone soft with age. The heather came from above, threaded with colder air. "The upper route," Thomas said. Minerva looked over the beams. Pale fungus furred the joints, and several supports had bowed under the weight of the earth. The lower passage looked the sounder of the 2, until you saw the faint green sheen on the water running through it. She touched the surface with her wand and drew off a single bead that smoked against the stone. "Upper," she agreed. Orin set one hand against the first beam. "It will hold a person." "One at a time?" "It will hold a person," he said again. Thomas went ahead without argument, testing each patch of ground before waving Katrina forward with Iona. Ewan came next with Orin's case, freeing the wandmaker to keep both hands on the walls, and Beatrice followed after them, which left Gideon and Minerva at the rear. Halfway up the slope, the tunnel shuddered. Dust ran down from the beams in long streams. Somewhere below, the sealed great passage gave a dull report, and green light briefly washed the lower chamber. Their pursuers had broken through a second time. Gideon looked back down the incline. They are gaining. So are we. The first beam cracked. Thomas reached back and caught Katrina's wrist, dragging her under it as one end came away from the wall. Orin got his shoulder to the timber long enough for Ewan and Beatrice to pass, and when Gideon started forward to help, Minerva took the bare rowan shaft from him and turned it up towards the ceiling. Hold it there. It cannot cast. It need not. She laid her own wand across the unfinished wood, and magic ran through the rowan in a rough, uneven pulse, not enough for a spell, but enough to stiffen the shaft into a brace. Gideon caught her meaning and drove it up beneath the broken beam. The wood bent, groaned, and held. Go.
Orin passed under the support, Gideon after him, one hand still raised until the last possible moment. Minerva crossed last and severed the weakened joint behind her, and the beam came down across the tunnel and brought a section of earth and stone with it. The passage filled with dust. Ewan coughed into his sleeve. Iona, too worn out now to hide it, began to sob against Katrina's shoulder. Thomas drew his family on while Orin counted the settling timbers under his breath. No green light showed through the collapse. The upper tunnel ended at a circular shaft barred by wooden slats, thin living roots hanging through the gaps, and somewhere above them a night bird gave a low call. Thomas climbed the iron rung set into the wall and pressed both hands to the cover. It is locked. Minerva raised her wand. The locking charm was old, and layered over it lay newer protective magic that carried the clean signature of the estate ahead. Breaking it might warn their allies, or it might be taken for an attack. She rested her forehead a moment against the damp stone, then traced the outermost charm. Beatrice watched her hand. Can we signal them? Possibly. Will they know it is us? No. The choice waited there in the shaft with them. Below, the tunnel held its quiet for now, though the pursuers would find the collapse in time. Above, protected ground lay close enough that the heather roots reached down through the slats. Minerva altered one small part of the estate charm. Instead of forcing the lock, she transfigured its warning pulse into the pattern Hogwarts used for a student in distress. 3 sharp beats, a pause, then 1. The magic traveled upward through the slats. Nothing answered. She sent it again, and this time a faint silver light appeared between the roots, the lock releasing with a soft wooden click. Thomas pushed the cover aside, and cold night air poured down into the shaft. One by one they climbed into a hollow beneath a stand of wind-bent pines. Beyond the trees lay open moorland, silvered by starlight, and far to the east a low wall marked the boundary of the protected estate. The sky above it was still dark, though its blackness had begun to thin at the edges. Between the pines and that wall, the moor offered nothing to hide behind. Heather lay low across the ground, broken only by black pools and ridges of stone that caught the thin starlight. Minerva counted the distance, then counted the people again. 7 remained, soaked through and shivering.
with perhaps half a mile still to cross. So that he could carry Ewan if the boy faltered, Thomas lowered Iona onto her feet. She swayed beneath the tartan, face pale above the dark wool. Katrina knelt to tighten both children's shoes with fingers stiffened by the cold, Orin standing close beside them with one hand pressed to his ribs, while Gideon stared back towards the open shaft. "We cannot leave that uncovered," he said. "We shall not." Minerva turned the wooden cover into a patch of rooted earth and drew heather across it until no seam remained. Beneath the false ground, she set a shallow loop in the passage so that anyone forcing it open would surface 20 yards west among the stones. The deception would not hold long, but long had ceased to be the measure they needed. A few minutes would do. Beatrice was looking towards the estate wall. "Why has no one come?" "They may be deciding whether our signal was genuine, and if they decide it was not, then we reach them before they finish deciding." The clerk tucked the watch list deeper inside her robes and nodded. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks, and the cold had drained her lips of nearly all their color, yet her wand stayed drawn and steady. Minerva placed her at the rear beside Gideon, where fear could be given a direction. The first 100 yards passed without incident. Thomas led them around the deepest pools, testing the ground with his heel before letting the children follow. One hand on Iona and the other on Ewan, Katrina refused every offer to carry either of them. Orin walked slowly, but never complained, his leather case tied across his back with a strip torn from his own coat. Behind them, the pines moved. No wind was strong enough to account for it. One branch lifted, then another, and a brief green flare shone between the trunks. Their pursuers had reached the shaft. "Do not run," Minerva said. No one obeyed quickly enough to look panicked. They lengthened their strides instead, keeping close and low among the heather, and Minerva came last, her wand angled behind her while pain gathered beneath the Dittany-sealed wound and crept towards her collarbone. A spell crossed the moor and struck the false opening 20 yards west, and stone burst upward in a dark spray. A second curse followed, then a third, all of them aimed at the wrong place. Gideon looked over his shoulder and nearly lost his footing. "Eyes ahead," Beatrice told him. He steadied himself against her arm. "You sound like her." "Then listen." With every step, the estate wall grew clearer. It was lower than Minerva had expected, gray stone capped with iron spikes, no higher than a man's shoulder, and no gate showed in the section before them. Beyond it stood an orchard, and the dark outline of a long house, every window shuttered. A green jet passed over their heads. This one had found them. Minerva turned and cast a shield with her right hand. The spell struck hard enough to drive her boots backwards through the wet ground. Her left arm swung uselessly, pulling at the wounded shoulder, but the shield held until the curse dispersed into sparks. "Down," she ordered. They dropped behind a ridge of stone scarcely high enough to hide the children. Thomas covered Ewan with his body while Katrina drew Iona beneath the tartan, and Orin took off the leather case and set it before him like a barricade, though the thin wood could have stopped nothing. 3 figures emerged from the pines. They did not advance at once. Their masks caught the starlight, pale and still above the dark robes. One raised a wand towards the estate, testing the boundary from a distance, while the others spread apart across the moor. Minerva looked at the wall again. Protection shimmered over it in faint silver layers, strong enough to resist entry and strong enough to keep those inside from seeing clearly beyond. The same defense that promised safety now stopped help from recognizing them. "We must identify ourselves," Beatrice whispered. "No names across open ground." "Then what?" Minerva took off her spectacles and wiped the wet lenses on her sleeve. One of the figures had begun moving east, angling to cut them off from the wall. Another lingered near the pines, sending short spells into the heather to flush them from cover. Orin opened his case. Among the unfinished shafts lay a narrow length of pale ash, polished but uncored, and he held it out without being asked. Minerva took it in her right hand and studied the grain. "You said they would not cast." "They will carry shape," he replied. "For a moment." She set her wand against the ash and transfigured the shaft into a silver tabby. It landed silently on the stone ridge, smaller and dimmer than a true Patronus, but recognizably hers. The cat looked once towards Minerva, then sprang across the open moor. A curse struck behind it and missed. Reaching the wall, the tabby passed through the outermost ward and dissolved in the orchard. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then one shutter on the longhouse opened, and a white light appeared behind it. The nearest masked figure saw it too, and raised his wand towards the children. Minerva stepped above the ridge. The curse left the masked figure's wand in a narrow green line, and she met it with a shield that formed late and at an angle enough to turn the spell aside but not to stop its force. The impact drove her down onto one knee. Her spectacles slipped from her fingers and vanished into the heather. "Wall," she said, "now." Thomas lifted Iona and ran bent low across the remaining ground, Katrina following with Ewan pressed against her side while Orin struggled after them, the leather case striking his back at every step. Before Gideon could turn towards Minerva, Beatrice seized his sleeve. Together they moved, stumbling and recovering towards the gray stones. A second curse struck the ridge and split it behind them. Minerva rose without her spectacles. Beyond a few yards, the moor blurred, reducing the pursuers to dark shapes and pale masks, but their wands shone clearly enough. She cast low across the ground, and heather roots lengthened into thick cords that twisted around boots and robes, delaying without holding. The nearest figure tore free. Another sent a slicing curse through the roots, cutting a black path towards her, and Minerva transfigured the severed stems into a flock of small dark birds that rose around the attackers in a rush of wings and confusion. She did not wait to see whether they scattered. At the wall, Thomas pressed one hand against the silver wards. The protection flashed and threw him backwards. Iona fell from his arms into the wet grass, stunned but breathing, and Katrina dragged Ewan clear of the sudden light. "It will not let us through," Thomas said. "It has not recognized you," Beatrice replied. She drew her ministry wand and touched it to the stones. The wand produced a weak silver knot, then another, each dissolving before it reached the inner layer. Gripping it with both hands, she tried again. Behind them, the birds vanished. Gideon faced the moor, holding only the bare rowan shaft. His shoulders shook, but he held his place between the approaching figures and the others. Orin came beside him and laid one hand over the young man's grip. "Do not ask it for a spell, the wandmaker said. "Ask it to remain straight." A red curse struck the shaft. Rowan flared white, bent nearly double, then sprang back to shape. Gideon staggered but did not drop it. Minerva reached them moments later, breathing hard, her left arm clamped against her ribs. She had no spectacles, so she found the boundary by touch, alone. Layers upon layers of protection had gone into that ward, family blood recognition, and beneath it a final refusal, designed to admit no one at all, while the estate stood under threat. Behind the shutter, the white light moved. A door opened somewhere inside the orchard. Two figures came into view beyond the wall, one carrying a lantern, the other holding a wand raised in both hands, and their voices reached the moor only as muffled shapes of sound through the barrier. "They can see us," Katrina said. "They can see movement. They cannot see whom." Another curse came across the heather as Minerva spoke, and she turned her back to the wall and raised a shield over the group. It formed as a curved sheet, thin at the edges, bright where the curse struck. The first impact cracked it. The second drove fractures clean through its center. Beatrice was staring at the ward beneath her palm. "The distress signal. Send it through me. It may burn out your wand. Then it burns." Minerva laid her wand across Beatrice's. The ministry wand fought it, trembling violently between the clerk's hands, but Beatrice held firm and repeated the Hogwarts pattern aloud as numbers rather than words. 3 beats. Pause. 1. Silver light entered the stones, and the boundary answered. A seam opened across the wall, no wider than a doorway, filled with white mist. Thomas pushed the children through first. Katrina followed, then Orin, who stopped long enough to turn and reach back for Gideon. Then the shield broke. Minerva caught the next curse on her wand and turned it into the ground, and the earth burst open at her feet. Gideon shoved Beatrice towards the opening and stayed where he was, the rowan shaft raised beside her. "You were told to go," she said, "Orca. I heard you." For 1 second, fear pulled visibly at him. Then another spell came, and he brought the shaft across its path. Rowan splintered end to end, taking enough force from the curse for Minerva to deflect what remained. She caught him by the collar and thrust him through the seam. Beatrice was already inside the orchard, one hand extended back through the mist. Minerva took it with her right hand and crossed, just as the two figures from the estate reached them, and the boundary closed behind her with a sound like a deep breath drawn in. Green curses struck the outer wall and dissolved across its silver surface. No one inside spoke. Thomas knelt over Iona, checking her pupils and her pulse. Katrina held Ewan against her. Orin sat down heavily beneath an apple tree with his case safe beside him. Gideon only stared at the broken rowan still clutched in his hand. Beatrice dug out Minerva's watch list from beneath her robes, wet, creased, ink-stained. But the final page had held legible, and she counted once before she wrote. All 7 remain, the orchard wards held. Green light moved across the outer wall in brief, furious veins, then broke apart over the silver protection and vanished among the wet stones. The 2 estate guardians took up positions near the sealed seam, wands raised but steady, and neither cast beyond the boundary. Inside, the only movement came from the apple branches. shedding drops onto the grass. Minerva stood there until she had counted every person again. Iona had opened her eyes and was trying to work out why there were leaves above her, and Thomas knelt at her side. Katrina checked her son's hands and face, then pressed him close enough to make him squirm. Beneath the tree, Orin sat with his leather case wedged between his boots. Gideon kept his place next to Beatrice, the split rowan shaft held flat across both palms. Only when the count was done did she lower her wand. One of the guardians came over, a square-built witch, iron gray hair plaited down her back, a heavy dressing gown thrown over dueling robes, and the buttons done up wrong in her haste. Her gaze traveled across the 7 refugees and stopped at Minerva's torn sleeve. "Inside," she said. "The boundary first. It is holding. Check the western corner." The witch looked towards the wall, saw something in Minerva's expression, and went without argument, her companion following with the lantern held low. A moment later, silver light strengthened along the orchard's western edge, where one layer of the ward had begun to thin. Minerva watched until the repair settled. Then her knees gave slightly. Beatrice caught her right elbow. The movement clumsy, almost too late, but it kept her upright. Dittany had closed the wound without touching the curse beneath it, and the whole left side of her body had started to shake, now that no spell demanded stillness of it. "There is a house," Beatrice said. 10 steps. Minerva looked towards it. Without her spectacles, the distance came apart, the doorway only a warm yellow shape beyond the trees. She moved off with Beatrice beside her and Gideon close behind, the pair of them acting as though neither trusted the ground to keep her. The long house had once been a hunting lodge. Its entrance hall smelled of beeswax and wet wool and banked fires. Blankets weighted over the backs of chairs, kettles steamed on a side table, and 3 household elves went briskly between the rooms with towels and bowls of hot water. Someone had made ready for frightened people without knowing a single one of their names. Thomas carried Iona to the nearest sofa. The child still wore Minerva's tartan, streaked now with mud and caught through with burrs, and when Katrina began to peel it off, she stopped. Iona had clutched the wool beneath her chin. "Leave it," Minerva said. Katrina's hand fell away, and she tucked the edge more securely around her daughter instead. Orin opened his leather case on the dining table and looked over each unfinished wand shaft. 2 had warped in the water. 1 had cracked where the platform struck the wall. He set those aside carefully and laid the rest in a dry cloth an elf had offered him. Gideon put the broken rowan down beside them. "I am sorry," he said. Orin turned the 2 halves over in his hands. It remained straight. Nothing more was needed. Gideon drew a chair up to the table and sat with both hands hanging between his knees, his coal-stained face gone slack with exhaustion. But when Ewan wandered near, he reached out and steadied the boy before he could go over the chair leg. Beatrice set the watch list on a clean square of linen. The ink had bled across several lines, and one corner was nearly worn through. She read it from the beginning, checking every entry against the faces in the room, then drew a last mark beneath the final sentence. The estate witch came back from the boundary carrying a pair of spectacles. "Found these in the heather," she said. "One lens is cracked." Minerva took them and fitted them on. The room sharpened imperfectly. A pale line divided the left lens, bending the firelight, splitting every flame into two, but the people in front of her came back into focus. Outside, the spells against the wall grew less frequent, long pauses opening between them. At last came a final green flare, weak at its edges, and after it the distant crack of apparition. The guardians stayed at their posts. No one in the house celebrated. Katrina held a cup beneath Iona's lips. On the floor sat Thomas, Ewan asleep across his lap. Orin wrapped the surviving wand shafts. Beatrice copied the names onto fresh parchment while Gideon gathered the wet pages and laid them out, separately to dry. Minerva stood by the eastern window. Beyond the orchard, the moor was still dark, but the dark had lost its depth. The first gray light rested low beneath the clouds, faint enough to be taken for mist, touching the wall and the wet grass and the branches above the hidden tunnel. Behind her, 7 people breathed. Across the room, Iona shifted in her sleep, and the tartan slipped from one shoulder. Minerva crossed and drew it back into place. When she returned to the window, the eastern sky had begun to pale. There's no record of that night. The people she saved went on to ordinary lives, which was the entire point. But every one of them saw the same thing before dawn. A woman in tartan who did not move, did not yield, and did not once let them believe the morning would not come. And then in the east, it did.